we're picking up with the second half and last part of our Humphrey book. Remember, the kids have all come in their costumes, and now the door just opened. Humphrey thought he was going to see Mr. E, but that's not what he saw at all. In came a grinning pumpkin head on a skinny skeleton body and a truly horrible old witch. She was all hunched over and leaned on a crooked wooden cane. Her face was hideous, with huge warts and a pointed nose and green skin. The room was silent as they walked to the front of the room and faced us. "How do witches tell time?" the pumpkin skeleton asked in a strange, high-pitched voice. "With a witch watch," the witch answered, and then she cackled wildly. "The sound made my fur stand on end." "What do you call a nervous witch?" the pumpkin skeleton asked. "A twitch," the weird witch answered, and cackled loudly again. I was about to go hide in my sleeping hut when the pumpkin skeleton asked another question. "And which witch are you?" the pumpkin skeleton asked. This time, the witch didn't answer. "Class, who knows which witch this is?" the skeleton asked us. For a few seconds, no one spoke or squeaked. Then, Small Paul shouted, "Mrs. Brisbane!" Mrs. Brisbane was a witch, and all this time I thought she was a ballerina. The witch reached up and took off her witchy face, which was just a mask. And there was Mrs. Brisbane, smiling happily at us. Everyone in the class cheered and clapped. Og splashed loudly. Boing, 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 boing. I climbed up to the top of my cage and shouted, "Welcome back!" Mr. E took off his pumpkin head and grinned. "I'm so happy to see all of you," Mrs. Brisbane said in her regular voice. "Mr. E came to visit me, and we planned the surprise for you. I'm so proud of how well you did on your math test." The door opened, and a mad scientist with wild white hair and a white coat came in, along with a clown with a red nose and a pink, blue, and green striped wig. "Happy Halloween!" The clown sounded just like Mrs. Wright. In fact, I was sure it was Mrs. Wright when I saw that the clown had a white whistle around her neck. "Welcome back," the mad scientist sounded just like Mr. Morales. "It's good to be back," Mrs. Brisbane said. Still leaning on her stick, Mrs. Brisbane hobbled over to see Og and me. "Of course, I missed my friends Og and Humphrey," she said. "I'm so glad to see you," I squeaked. Og jumped for joy. Boing! "Hi, Og. Hello, Humphrey," Mrs. Brisbane said. "You know, Humphrey, you're the cause of this." My heart sank to my toes. "What did I do?" I squeaked. Our teacher turned to the class. "You see, I was running a little late for school that morning. I was already in my car when I realized I'd forgotten Humphrey's vegetable treat. As I ran back into the house, my heel caught on the front step and I tumbled down and broke my ankle." She lifted a corner of her long witch's skirt and showed us her cast. "I'm unsqueakably sorry," I told her. "I couldn't reach my phone and Mr. Brisbane wasn't home, so I couldn't call the school to tell them I wouldn't be in," she explained. So that's why Mr. Morales had been so confused that morning. "My neighbor finally found me and took me to the hospital. I had to have an operation on my ankle before I could start walking again," she continued. "But of course, it was all my fault and not Humphrey's. What did I forget to do, Kelsey?" "You forgot to pay attention to what you were doing," Kelsey answered. At least I wasn't pie-whacked about what happened anymore. The mystery was solved at last. I was happy to have our teacher back, but I wished she'd learned to be a ballet dancer instead of breaking her ankle. Ouch! Mr. E brought a chair for Mrs. Brisbane, and it was time for Mr. Morales and Mrs. Wright to judge the costumes. I dove down into my bedding, found my yarn, and put on my costume. Mr. Morales and Mrs. Wright smiled and whispered as they watched my friends parade around the room. No one was watching me, so to get their attention, I began squeaking loudly. "Squeak! Squeak! Look at me!" I repeated over and over. Finally, Mrs. Brisbane turned to see what was wrong, and she burst out laughing. "What on earth is Humphrey wearing?" Everyone rushed over to my cage, so I stood up on my rear paws and squeaked some more. "He's got red yarn on his head," Rosie said. Thomas leaned in and held up his magnifying glass. "It's red yarn, all right." Joey leaned in and held up his magnifying glass. "It looks like hair. Red hair." Kelsey giggled. "He looks like a redhead from the Redheaded League story." I guess it took a redhead to recognize another redhead. Everyone was laughing and pointing, except Mr. Morales and Mrs. Wright. They were whispering and pointing. "Who gave Humphrey that yarn?" Mrs. Brisbane asked. No one answered. "Whoever you are a very clever person," she said. For once, Mrs. Brisbane was wrong. I am a very clever hamster. Mr. Morales announced that he and Mrs. Wright had made a decision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a blue ribbon that had best costume written on it. It's a tie between Rosie Rodriguez and Humphrey. Boing, 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 Og cheered. He knew I'd wanted to win. Everyone else cheered too, and Mr. Morales put the ribbon on my cage. He had another best costume ribbon, which he gave to Rosie. I was proud to share the honor with her. Of course, you're all winners in room 26, he said. Mrs. Brisbane is coming back to teach next week, so I think we should all thank Mr. E for doing a great job. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold ribbon that had Best Substitute written on it. Mr. E looked very happy to accept it. Now, boys and girls, Mrs. Murch is going on a medical leave next week, so room 29 needs a substitute. Do you think I should recommend Mr. E? Everyone cheered wildly, even Mrs. Wright. Then they passed out treats for everyone, including some sunflower seeds for me. All I can say is it was a super, super, super great party. That night, when Og and I were alone in room 26, I guess I was the happiest hamster on earth. I'd made my friends laugh, and I had a shiny blue ribbon on my cage. My favorite teacher, Mrs. Brisbane, was coming back. My next favorite teacher, Ms. Mapp, was just down the hall. My other favorite teacher, Mr. E, would still be at Longfellow School for a while. And even though I had just solved a lot of mysteries in room 26, I knew that as long as I was a hamster, living in a classroom full of humans, I'd always have plenty of mysteries to solve, just like Sherlock Holmes. Humphrey's Detectionary. Sometimes even excellent clues can lead you in the wrong direction, but it doesn't really matter if everything ends well and your teacher comes back. The end.